All right, listeners, today we're going to be diving into French and more specifically, how to navigate the tricky world of formal versus informal French.
Yeah.
So if you ever wondered, like, when to use tu versus vous, or how to write an email to your professor without sounding,
Too casual.
or even just how to decode some of that cool French slang you might hear out there, this is the deep dive for you.
Absolutely.
Especially if you're going for that pronunciator certificate on formal versus informal French in the library module.
Yep. This is going to help you ace that exam.
All right. So
Yeah.
what is it about French that makes this whole formality thing such a big deal?
Well, I think one of the things that's really cool about French is that it's not just about, like memorizing grammar rules.
Right.
It's about understanding like the unspoken rules, the subtle cues that tell you
Interesting.
how to fit in, how to show respect, or even
I like that.
just how to sound like you belong to the group.
So where do we even begin with all this? Like, what are some of the key things that trip people up when it comes to French formality?
Well, I think the cornerstone of French formality, the thing that trips up almost every learner at some point, is the whole tu versus vous dilemma.
All right, tu and vous.
Right. So
The two different ways to say you.
exactly. So you have tu, which is that friendly, informal you that you'd use with, your buddies, family, people you're close to.
Gotcha.
And then you have vous, which is the formal you, showing respect, acknowledging authority, or just keeping things polite with strangers, people you don't know very well.
Okay, and so I imagine messing that up could lead to some pretty awkward moments.
Definitely, yeah.
Like accidentally calling your boss tu.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic faux pas.
Yeah.
You want to avoid that.
So it's not just about who you're talking to, though, right?
Right, it's about the situation, the context. So even something as simple as like asking for the time can sound totally different.
Oh, interesting.
Depending on whether you're asking a friend or asking a stranger on the street.
Okay, so give me an example of that.
So like you wouldn't say tout à l'heure to someone you just met on the street.
Right,
okay?
definitely not.
That's way too informal.
So what would I say in that situation?
You'd say quelle heure est-il, s'il vous plaît? Quelle heure est-il, s'il vous plaît?
Exactly.
Okay.
So you can see how the vous and the s'il vous plaît, that all adds a layer of courtesy and formality. That just makes it more appropriate for that situation.
Okay, so it's about fitting the language to the context.
Exactly.
So let's talk about another context that can be really tricky for a lot of language learners. Emails.
Oh, yeah.
Because emails are like, they're not quite a conversation.
They have their own rules.
They have their own rules, so
Right.
what are some of the things we need to keep in mind when it comes to formal versus informal in emails? Yeah, so, I mean, you definitely don't want to start an email to your professor with a salut, right?
Salut, no.
That's a big no-no. You want to go with a bonjour. It's much more formal, shows respect. And then same thing with signing off.
Right.
You're not going to end your email with an A+ tard.
Yeah, no, A+ tard.
No.
To my professor.
Right, so what are some more formal alternatives?
Yeah, what are some good formal sign-offs for an email?
Cordialement is a good one.
Cordialement? Okay.
That's sort of like sincerely.
Gotcha.
Or you could go with sincere salutations.
Oh, sincere salutations. Okay.
It's a little bit longer, but it still conveys that sense of respect and professionalism.
Okay, so it's like choosing the right outfit.
Yeah.
For the occasion, but
exactly.
with words.
With words.
I like that.
Yeah.
All right, so we've talked about tu versus vous. We've talked about greetings and closings in emails.
Right.
What are some other...
So many other nuances.
Nuances that signal formal versus informal?
Well, even things as simple as, like, contractions.
Oh, okay.
Can signal informality, right?
So, like, say versus...
Yeah. So, say is that everyday contraction that you'd use with friends, family.
Right.
Whereas say... Yeah. That's much more formal, and you very rarely hear it in spoken French. Yes. You might see it in like formal writing, but it really shows that you're paying attention to the rules, the conventions of the language.
Okay, so these little things, these little details can actually make a big difference.
Oh yeah, they really change how your French comes across to a native speaker.
Okay, what about verb choices? Do verbs also play a role in formality?
For sure, yeah. So, like, if you're hanging out with friends, you might say bosser for to work, which has more of a slangy, casual vibe.
Okay.
Whereas if you're writing to your professor, you'd stick with the more formal, trivialer.
So it's like choosing between hang out and spend time with?
Yes.
In English, it's like one is way more.
One's more formal, one's more laid back.
Yeah.
Same idea.
Okay, cool. So even the verbs themselves can signal formality.
Exactly.
Okay. Let's see.
There are so many other things.
There's so many things, but
yeah, I mean,
what about like even something as simple as saying I don't know?
Oh, yeah.
Are there different ways to say that?
Totally.
That are more or less formal?
Yeah. So je ne sais pas is like your go-to formal phrase.
Okay.
But with friends, you might just say like casually j'en sais rien, or even just sais pas.
C'est pas.
Yeah, just like drop in all the extra words.
Wow. So it's like choosing the right tool for the job, but with language.
Exactly.
All right. I love that.
Yeah. Welcome back to our deep dive into formal and informal French.
All right. So now that we've kind of laid the groundwork, I'm ready to put all this knowledge into practice.
Exactly. Let's see how this all plays out.
Yeah,
in your lives.
world situations. Yeah,
right.
Especially because I have my eye on that pronunciator certificate.
Yes, you gotta ace that exam.
I gotta ace that exam.
Yeah.
So let's jump into some scenarios.
All right, let's do it.
Okay. So imagine you're at a fancy French restaurant.
Ooh la la.
And you want to ask the waiter for the wine list.
Okay.
How would you do that using your formal French skills?
Okay, let's see. So I know I need to use vous with the waiter.
Right.
And I probably want to be extra polite. So could I say, excusez-moi, pourriez-vous m'apporter la carte des vins, s'il vous plaît?
Magnifique. You nailed it.
You
used the formal vous, the polite conditional tense. And even added the s'il vous plaît for that extra touch of courtesy.
So I'm being polite and I'm showing off my grammar skills.
Exactly. Yep. Two birds, one stone. All right, let's switch gears to something a little more casual.
Okay.
Let's say I'm texting my friend, and I want to see if they want to grab coffee later.
Okay.
What would I say in that situation?
All right, so now you can ditch the formality and use some of that more relaxed language.
So I could say something like, hey, Arandi, envie d'un café tout à l'heure.
Parfait. Perfect.
Yeah, you use the informal tu and even a bit of slang with the tout à l'heure for later. No. So that's perfect for a casual text with a friend.
So it really is all about like reading the room.
The context.
And knowing who you're talking to.
Exactly.
Okay. What about emails to professors? Because I feel like,
ooh, yeah,
that's always a tricky one for me.
Email etiquette can be a minefield, for sure.
It can be. Like, you don't want to be too formal.
Right.
But you also don't want to be too casual.
Exactly.
So how do you find that balance?
Well, I think the key thing to keep in mind is that
clarity and respect are really important when you're communicating with professors. So you want to make sure your message is clear. But you also want to use language that shows that you respect their position.
Okay, so no starting with salut or ending with like a ciao? Exactly.
Stick with bonjour and cordialement to keep things professional.
And I imagine sentence structure and things like that also matter.
Absolutely. Yeah, you want to avoid slang or overly casual expressions.
Right.
And remember, a well-placed subjunctive can go a long way.
Oh, the subjunctive, yes. Can we talk about that for a sec? Because I feel like that's...
Yeah, it's tricky for a lot of people.
Yeah, it always trips me up.
So can you remind me what the subjunctive is all about?
Yes, please remind me.
So the subjunctive is a special verb mood.
Okay.
It's often used for expressing wishes or doubts or making polite requests. You can kind of think of it as like adding a layer of please or I would be grateful if to your sentence.
Oh.
So it makes your request sound more polite and respectful.
Okay, so let's say I need to ask my professor for an extension on an assignment.
Yeah.
How could I use the subjunctive in that situation?
You could say something like, je vous serais reconnaissant si vous pouviez m'accorder un délai supplémentaire.
Je vous serais reconnaissant si vous pouviez m'accorder un délai supplémentaire.
Exactly.
Okay, and that basically means I would be grateful if you could grant me an extension.
Exactly.
Okay, that sounds so much better than just saying, like, give me an extension.
All right, it's much more polite and respectful.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, and it shows your professor that you understand French grammar and etiquette.
Right, which is
important.
Important, especially if I'm going for that pronunciator certificate.
Exactly.
All right. Okay, subjunctive check.
Yeah.
All right, what else? What other scenarios can we practice with?
All right, how about this? You're at a party and you strike up a conversation with someone new.
Okay.
How would you navigate that initial interaction in French?
Okay, so it's a social setting. So I might start with a casual salut.
Okay.
But then I'm thinking I should probably stick with vous for now.
Right.
Until I get a sense of how comfortable they are with, like, being informal.
C'est ça, yeah.
Okay.
You want to kind of like start casually but maintain a little bit of politeness when you're first meeting someone.
Yeah.
And then you can always adjust
as
the conversation goes on.
So it's kind of like a dance where you're like feeling it out and adjusting your steps.
Exactly. Yeah, you're reading their cues and you're responding accordingly.
Okay, now what about slang? Is it ever okay to like throw in some verlan?
Ooh.
Even in a formal setting?
I mean, it's great that you're feeling adventurous with your French, but verlan is almost always a marker of informal language.
Okay.
So it's best to save it for casual conversations with friends or peers who are kind of in that linguistic in-group.
I guess it'd be like showing up to a job interview in like ripped jeans and a t-shirt.
Yeah.
It's just not the right fit for the occasion.
Okay, so read the room.
Read the room, know your audience.
Know your audience, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Can we revisit those object pronouns?
Oh, yeah, those tricky little pronouns.
Because I feel like we touched on this earlier.
Right.
But I'm still a little fuzzy on like when they go before the verb and when they go after the verb.
Yeah, they can be a bit confusing, for sure.
They can.
But there are some general rules to keep in mind.
Okay.
So in formal French, object pronouns usually go before the verb. But in informal speech, and in some regional dialects, you might hear them after the verb.
So like if I wanted to say, I see him formally, it would be je le vois.
Exactly.
But informally, it might be je vois le.
Yeah, you got it.
Okay.
It's a subtle difference, but it's one of those things that can make your French sound more natural.
Right, like you actually know what you're doing.
Exactly. Okay, so what if I'm just like, I'm in a situation and I'm not sure which register to use? Like, what's the best way to approach that?
I think when in doubt, it's always better to err on the side of formality.
Okay.
You can always adjust your language later on if the situation becomes more relaxed.
So kind of start formal and then feel it out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, I like that approach.
And really, the more you expose yourself to authentic French, the more you'll develop that intuition.
Right. So it's all about like immersing yourself in the language.
Exactly.
And getting a feel for how it's actually used.
Exactly.
Okay, so far we've talked about tu versus vous. We've talked about email etiquette. We've talked about slang, pronouns, all sorts of good stuff.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
We have. But I'm curious, like, from your perspective, what are some of the most common mistakes that you see learners making when it comes to French register?
Well, I think one of the most common mistakes is overusing tu.
In situations where vous would be more appropriate.
Yeah.
I think it's easy to forget. You know, in English, we just have you for everything.
Yeah, we don't have that distinction.
But in French, that distinction is really important.
Right, it's a big deal.
It is a big deal, yeah.
Okay, so what else? What other mistakes do you see?
Another common one is using slang or, you know, overly casual expressions in formal settings. Like if you're writing an email to a professor or if you're giving a presentation.
Gotcha.
Those are situations where you want to stick to more formal language.
Yeah, you got to know your audience.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's all about being mindful of the context.
Right.
And choosing the language that fits the situation.
Exactly.
All right, well, this has been, I feel like my brain is exploding a little bit.
Good, that means you're learning.
I'm learning, yeah.
That's a good thing.
It's a good kind of exploding.
Yeah.
Okay, well, this has been super helpful.
I'm glad.
I feel much more confident about tackling these tricky situations now.
Excellent.
Before we wrap things up, I'm curious to hear a little bit more about like the history and the evolution of formal and informal French.
Okay, let's get into that in our final part.
Stay tuned because we're going to be diving deep into the history of French register.
All right, we'll see you there.
Welcome back, language lovers. I feel like we've covered so much ground already in this deep dive into formal and informal French. But
yeah, we have, but
there's still more to explore.
There's always more.
Always more. Yeah, so in this final part, we're going to be stepping back and taking a look at the bigger picture.
Exactly, looking at the history and evolution of formal and informal French.
So tell me, how has French register changed over time? Like, what are some of the major events or trends that have shaped the way we speak and write French today?
Well, I think one of the biggest turning points was the French Revolution.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, that was a massive societal upheaval that, completely redefined France.
Yeah.
And had a huge impact on language, too.
So it wasn't just a political revolution, it was a linguistic revolution as well.
Exactly, yeah. So before the revolution, the dominant style of speech was very elaborate, very aristocratic. It was all about, showing off your status and your education.
Yeah, sure.
But after the revolution, there was this big push for simpler, more accessible language.
So it's like the language itself became more democratic.
Exactly, yeah. People wanted a language that reflected the values of liberty, equality, and fraternity.
I like that. So the revolution actually changed the way people spoke.
It did, yeah. And that trend towards simpler language continued into the 20th century with the rise of mass media and popular culture. Things like radio, television, movies.
Right.
They all introduced new slang and informal vocabulary that spread really quickly.
Makes sense. I mean, you think about how, social media and texting are influencing language today.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
We're constantly coming up with new abbreviations, new emojis, new slang to express ourselves more quickly and informally.
It's really fascinating to see how technology is accelerating language change and kind of blurring the lines between formal and informal communication.
Yeah, it's like the rules are constantly evolving.
They are.
So given all of that, what do you think the future holds for French register? Do you think tu and vous will eventually just become interchangeable?
That's a great question. I mean, it's hard to predict the future of language, but I think it's more likely that we'll see a continued evolution of register with new nuances and variations emerging.
So instead of everything just becoming one big informal blob, we might see an even more intricate tapestry of language choices.
Exactly. Yeah, and it'll be up to us as speakers and learners to navigate those complexities.
Yeah. Okay, so be prepared to keep learning and adapting.
Always, yeah. Language is always changing.
That's true. Okay, so we've talked about the history, we've talked about the future. Any final thoughts or words of wisdom for our listeners, especially those who are working towards that pronunciator certificate?
My advice would be to just keep practicing. Keep observing and keep immersing yourself in the language.
That's all about exposure and experience.
Exactly. The more you engage with authentic French, the more intuitive your understanding of register will become.
And don't forget to have fun.
Yes, absolutely. Language learning should be enjoyable.
It should be. Well, this has been an amazing journey exploring the world of formal and informal French.
I agree. It's been a great deep dive.
It has. So to all our listeners out there, keep diving deep into the language, keep challenging yourselves, and keep having fun with it.
Au revoir.
Au revoir.